Chapter 4, Captivity. A single traumatic event can occur almost anywhere. Prolonged repeated trauma, by contrast, occurs only in circumstances of captivity. When the victim is free to escape, she will not be abused a second time. Repeated trauma occurs only when the victim is a prisoner, unable to flee, and under the control of the perpetrator. Such conditions obviously exist in prisons, concentration camps, and slave labor camps. These conditions may also exist in religious cults, in brothels, and other institutions of organized sexual exploitation and families. Political captivity is generally recognized, whereas the domestic captivity of women and children is often unseen. A man's home is his castle. Rarely is it understood that the same home may be a prison for women and children. In domestic captivity, physical barriers to escape are rare. In most homes, even the most oppressive, there are no bars on the windows, no barbed wire fences. Women and children are not ordinarily chained, though even this occurs more often than one might think. The barriers to escape are generally invisible. They are nonetheless extremely powerful. Children are rendered captive by their condition of dependency. Women are rendered captive by economic, social, psychological, and legal subordination, as well as by physical force. Captivity, which brings the victim into prolonged contact with the perpetrator, creates a special type of relationship, one of coercive control. This is equally true whether the victim is taken captive entirely by force, as is the case of prisoners and hostages, or by a combination of force, intimidation, and enticement, as in the case of religious cult members, battered women, and abused children. The psychological impact of subordination to coercive control may have many common features, whether that subordination occurs within the public sphere of politics or within the private sphere of sexual and domestic relations. In situations of captivity, the perpetrator becomes the most powerful person in the life of the victim, and the psychology of the victim is shaped by the actions and beliefs of the perpetrator. Little is known about the mind of the perpetrator. Since he is contemptuous of those who seek to understand him, he does not volunteer to be studied. Since he does not perceive that anything is wrong with him, he does not seek help unless he is in trouble with the law. His most consistent feature in both the testimony of victims and the observations of psychologists is his apparent normality. Ordinary concepts of psychopathology fail to define or comprehend him. This idea is deeply disturbing to most people. How much more comforting it would be if the perpetrator were easily recognizable, obviously deviant or disturbed, but he is not. The legal scholar Hannah Arendt created a scandal when she reported that Adolf Eichmann, a man who committed unfathomable crimes against humanity, had been certified by half a dozen psychiatrists as normal. Quote, "The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together." End quote. Authoritarian, secretive, sometimes grandiose, and even paranoid, the perpetrator is nevertheless exquisitely sensitive to the realities of power and to social norms. Only rarely does he get into difficulties with the law. Rather, he seeks out situations where his tyrannical behavior will be tolerated, condoned, or admired. His demeanor provides an excellent camouflage, for few people believe that extraordinary crimes can be committed by men of such conventional appearance. The perpetrator's first goal appears to be the enslavement of his victim, and he accomplishes this goal by exercising despotic control over every aspect of the victim's life. But simple compliance rarely satisfies him. He appears to have a psychological need to justify his crimes, and for this he needs the victim's affirmation. Thus he relentlessly demands from his victim professions of respect, gratitude, or even love. His ultimate goal appears to be the creation of a willing victim. Hostages, political prisoners, battered women, and slaves have all remarked upon the captor's curious psychological dependence upon his victim. George Orwell gives voice to the totalitarian mind in the novel 1984, quote, "We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will. We do not destroy the heretic because he resists us. So long as he resists us, we never destroy him. We convert him, we capture his inner mind, we reshape him. We burn all evil and all illusion out of him. We bring him over to our side, not in appearance, but genuinely, heart and soul." Unquote. The desire for total control over another person is the common denominator of all forms of tyranny. Totalitarian governments demand confession and political conversion of their victims. Slaveholders demand gratitude of their slaves. Religious cults demand ritualized sacrifices as a sign of submission to the divine will of the leader. Perpetrators of domestic battery demand that their victims prove complete obedience and loyalty by sacrificing all other relationships. Sex offenders demand that their victims find sexual fulfillment in submission. Total control over another person is the power dynamic at the heart of pornography. The erotic appeal of this fantasy to millions of terrifyingly normal men fosters an immense industry in which women and children are abused, not in fantasy, but in reality. Psychological domination. The methods that enable one human being to enslave another are remarkably consistent. The accounts of hostages, political prisoners, and survivors of concentration camps from every corner of the globe have an uncanny sameness. Drawing upon the testimony of political prisoners from widely differing cultures, Amnesty International in 1973 published a quote-unquote chart of coercion, describing these methods in detail. In tyrannical political systems, it is sometimes possible to trace the actual transmission of coercive methods from one clandestine police force or terrorist group to another. These same techniques are used to subjugate women in prostitution, in pornography, and in the home. In organized criminal activities, pimps and pornographers sometimes instruct one another in the use of coercive methods. The systematic use of coercive techniques to break women into prostitution is known as quote-unquote seasoning. Even in domestic situations where the batterer is not part of any larger organization and has had no formal instruction in these techniques, he seems time and again to reinvent them. The psychologist Lenore Walker, in her study of battered women, observed that the abuser's coercive techniques, quote, although unique for each individual, were still remarkably similar, unquote. The methods of establishing control over another person are based upon the systematic, repetitive infliction of psychological trauma. They are the organized techniques of disempowerment and disconnection. Methods of psychological control are designed to instill terror and helplessness and to destroy the victim's sense of self in relation to others. Although violence is a universal method of terror, the perpetrator may use violence infrequently as a last resort. It is not necessary to use violence often to keep the victim in a constant state of fear. The threat of death or serious harm is much more frequent than the actual resort to the violence. Threats against others are often as effective as direct threats against the victim. Battered women, for example, frequently report that their abuser has threatened to kill their children, their parents, or any friends who harbor them should they attempt to escape. Fear is also increased by inconsistent and unpredictable outbursts of violence and by capricious enforcement of petty rules. The ultimate effect of these techniques is to convince the victim that the perpetrator is omnipotent, that resistance is futile, and that her life depends upon winning his indulgence through absolute compliance. The goal of the perpetrator is to instill in his victim not only fear of death, but also gratitude for being allowed to live. Survivors of domestic or political captivity often describe occasions in which they were convinced that they would be killed only to be spared at the last moment. After several cycles of reprieve from certain death, the victim may come to view the perpetrator paradoxically as her savior. In addition to inducing fear, the perpetrator seeks to destroy the victim's sense of autonomy. This is achieved by scrutiny and control of the victim's body and bodily functions. The perpetrator supervises what the victim eats, when she sleeps, when she goes to the toilet, what she wears. When the victim is deprived of food, sleep, or exercise, this control results in physical debilitation. But even when the victim's basic physical needs are adequately met, this assault on bodily autonomy shames and demoralizes her. Irina Ratushinskaya, a political prisoner, describes the methods of her captors. Quote, all these norms of human behavior which are inculcated in one from the cradle are subjected to deliberate and systematic destruction. It's normal to want to be clean, contract scabies and skin fungus, live in filth, breathe the stench of the slop bucket, then you'll regret your misdemeanors. Women are prone to modesty. All the more reason to strip them naked during searches. A normal person is repelled by coarseness and lies. You will encounter such an amount of both that you will have to strain all your inner resources to remember that there is another reality. Only by a maximum exertion of will is it possible to retain one's former normal scale of values. End quote. In religious cults, members may be subjected to strict regulation of their diet and dress and may be subjected to exhaustive questioning regarding their deviations from these rules. Similarly, sexual and domestic prisoners frequently describe long periods of sleep deprivation during sessions of jealous interrogation, as well as meticulous supervision of their clothing, appearance, weight, and diet. And almost always with female prisoners, whether in political or in domestic life, control of the body includes sexual threats and violations. A battered woman describes her experience of marital rape. Quote, it was a very brutal marriage. He was so patriarchal. He felt he owned me and the children, that I was his property. In the first 3 weeks of our marriage, he told me to regard him as God and his word as gospel. If I didn't want sex and he did, my wishes didn't matter. One time, I didn't want it, so we really fought. He was furiously angry that I would deny him. I was protesting and pleading, and he was angry because he said I was his wife and had no right to refuse him. We were in bed, and he was able to force himself physically on me. He's bigger than I am, and he just held me down and raped me. End quote. Once the perpetrator has succeeded in establishing day-to-day bodily control of the victim, he becomes a source not only of fear and humiliation, but also of solace. The hope of a meal, a bath, a kind word, or some other ordinary creature comfort can become compelling to a person long enough deprived. The perpetrator may further debilitate the victim by offering addictive drugs or alcohol. The capricious granting of small indulgences undermines the psychological resistance of the victim far more effectively than unremitting deprivation and fear. Patricia Hearst, held hostage by a terrorist cell, describes how her compliance was rewarded by small improvements in the conditions of her imprisonment. Quote, by agreeing with them, I was taken out of the closet more and more often. They allowed me to eat with them at times, and occasionally I sat blindfolded with them late into the night as they held one of their discussion meetings or study groups. They allowed me to remove my blindfold when I was locked in the closet for the night, and that was a blessing. End quote. Political prisoners who are aware of the methods of coercive control devote particular attention to maintaining their sense of autonomy. One form of resistance is refusing to comply with petty demands or to accept rewards. The hunger strike is the ultimate expression of this resistance. Because the prisoner voluntarily subjects himself to greater deprivation than that willed by his captor, he affirms his sense of integrity and self-control. The psychologist Joel Dimsdale describes a woman prisoner in the Nazi concentration camps who fasted on Yom Kippur in order to prove that her captors had not defeated her. Political prisoner Natan Sharansky describes the psychological effect of active resistance. Quote, as soon as I announced my hunger strike, I got rid of the feeling of despair and helplessness and the humiliation of being forced to tolerate the KGB's tyranny. The bitterness and angry determination that had been building up during the past 9 months now gave way to a kind of strange relief. At long last, I was actively defending myself and my world from them. End quote. The use of intermittent rewards to bind the victim to the perpetrator reaches its most elaborate forms in domestic battery. Since no physical barrier prevents escape, the victim may attempt to flee after an outburst of violence. She is often persuaded to return, not by further threats, but by apologies, expressions of love, promises of reform, and appeals to loyalty and compassion. For a moment, the balance of power in the relationship appears to be reversed, as the batterer does everything in his power to win over his victim. The intensity of his possessive attention is unchanged, but its quality is dramatically transformed. He insists that his domineering behavior simply proves his desperate need and love for her. He may himself believe this. Further, he pleads that his fate is in her hands and that she has the power to end the violence by offering ever greater proofs of her love for him. Walker observes that the, quote, reconciliation phase is a crucial step in breaking down the psychological resistance of the battered woman. A woman who eventually escaped a battering relationship describes how these intermittent rewards bound her to the abuser. Quote, it was really cyclical, actually, and the odd thing was that in the good periods I could hardly remember the bad times. It was almost as if I was leading 2 different lives, end quote. Additional methods, however, are usually needed to achieve complete domination. As long as the victim maintains any other human connection, the perpetrator's power is limited. It is for this reason that perpetrators universally seek to isolate their victims from any other source of information, material aid, or emotional support. The stories of political prisoners are filled with accounts of their captors' attempts to prevent communication from the outside world and to convince them that their closest allies have forgotten or betrayed them. And the record of domestic violence is filled with accounts of jealous surveillance, such as stalking, eavesdropping, and intercepting letters or telephone calls, which results in solitary confinement of the battered woman within her home. Along with relentless accusations of infidelity, the batterer demands that his victim prove her loyalty to him by giving up her work and, with it, an independent source of income, her friendships, and even ties to her family. The destruction of attachments requires not only the isolation of the victim from others, but also the destruction of her internal images of connection to others. For this reason, the perpetrator often goes to great lengths to deprive his victim of any objects of symbolic importance. A battered woman describes how her boyfriend demanded a ritual sacrifice of tokens of attachment. Quote, he didn't hit me, but he got very angry. I thought it was because he was fond of me and he was jealous. But I didn't realize until afterwards that it was nothing to do with fondness. It was quite different. He asked me a lot of questions about who I had been out with before I knew him, and he made me bring from the house a whole file of letters and photographs, and he stood over me as I stood over an open drain in the road, and I had to put them in one by one, tear them up, and put them in. End quote. At the beginning of the relationship, this woman was able to persuade herself that she was making only a small symbolic concession. The accounts of battered women are filled with such sacrifices, reluctantly made, which slowly and imperceptibly destroy their ties to others. Many women in hindsight describe themselves as walking into a trap. The coerced prostitute and pornographic film star Linda Lovelace describes how she was gradually ensnared by a pimp who first persuaded her to break her ties to her parents. Quote, I went along with him. As I say these words, I realize that I went along with too much in those days. No one was twisting my arm, not yet. Everything was mild and gradual, one small step, and then another. It started in such small ways that I didn't see the pattern until much later. End quote. Prisoners of conscience who have a highly developed awareness of the strategies of control and resistance generally understand that isolation is the danger to be avoided at all costs, and that there is no such thing as a small concession when the issue is preserving their connections with the outside world. As tenaciously as their captors seek to destroy their relationships, these prisoners tenaciously seek to maintain communication with the world outside the one in which they are confined. They deliberately practice evoking mental images of the people they love in order to preserve their sense of connection. They also fight to preserve physical tokens of fidelity. They may risk their lives for the sake of a wedding ring, a letter, a photograph, or some other small memento of attachment. Such risks, which may appear heroic or foolish to outsiders, are undertaken for supremely pragmatic reasons. Under conditions of prolonged isolation, prisoners need quote-unquote transitional objects to preserve their sense of connection to others. They understand that to lose these symbols of attachment is to lose themselves. As the victim is isolated, she becomes increasingly dependent on the perpetrator, not only for survival and basic bodily needs, but also for information and even for emotional sustenance. The more frightened she is, the more she is tempted to cling to the one relationship that is permitted, the relationship with the perpetrator. In the absence of any other human connection, she will try to find the humanity in her captor. Inevitably, in the absence of any other point of view, the victim will come to see the world through the eyes of the perpetrator. Hirsch describes entering into a dialogue with her captors, thinking she could outwit them, but before long, she was the one outwitted. Quote, in time, although I was hardly aware of it, they turned me around completely, or almost completely. As a prisoner of war, kept blindfolded in that closet for 2 long months, I had been bombarded incessantly with the SLE's interpretation of life, politics, economic, social conditions, and current events. Upon my release from the closet, I had thought I was humoring them by parroting their cliches and buzzwords without personally believing in them. Then a sort of numbed shock set in. To maintain my own sanity and equilibrium while functioning day to day in this new environment, I had learned to act by rote like a good soldier, doing as I was told and suspending disbelief. Reality for them was different from all that I had known before, and their reality by this time had become my reality. End quote. Prisoners of conscience are well aware of the danger of ordinary human engagement with their captors. Of all prisoners, this group is the most prepared to withstand the corrosive psychological effects of captivity. They have chosen a course in life with full knowledge of its dangers, they have a clear definition of their own principles, and they have strong faith in their allies. Nevertheless, even this highly conscious and motivated group of people realize that they are at risk of developing emotional dependence upon their captors. They protect themselves only by uncompromising refusal to enter into even the most superficial social relationship with their adversaries. Sharansky describes how he felt drawn to his captors. Quote, I was becoming aware of all the human areas that the KGB men and I had in common. While this was natural enough, it was also dangerous, for the growing sense of our common humanity could easily become the first step in my surrender. If my interrogators were my only link to the outside world, I would come to depend on them and to look for areas of agreement." End quote. Whereas prisoners of conscience need to summon all their resources to avoid developing emotional dependence upon their captors, people who lack this remarkable degree of preparation, political awareness, and moral support usually develop some degree of dependence. Attachment between hostage and captor is the rule rather than the exception. Prolonged confinement while in fear of death and in isolation from the outside world reliably produces a bond of identification between captor and victim. Hostages, after their release, have been known to defend their captor's cause, to visit them in prison, and to raise money for their defense. The emotional bond that develops between a battered woman and her abuser, though comparable to that of a hostage and captor, has some unique aspects based on the special attachment between victim and perpetrator in domestic abuse. A hostage is taken prisoner by surprise. She initially knows nothing about the captor, or she regards him as an enemy. Under duress, the hostage gradually loses her previous belief system. She eventually comes to empathize with the captor and to see the world from the captor's point of view. In domestic battery, by contrast, the victim is taken prisoner gradually by courtship. An analogous situation is found in the recruitment technique of quote-unquote love bombing, practiced by some religious cults. The woman who becomes emotionally involved with the batterer initially interprets his possessive attention as a sign of passionate love. She may at first feel flattered and comforted by his intense interest in every aspect of her life. As he becomes more domineering, she may minimize or excuse his behavior, not only because she fears him, but also because she cares for him. In order to resist developing the emotional dependence of a hostage, she will have to come to a new and independent view of her situation, in active contradiction to the belief system of her abuser. Not only will she have to avoid developing empathy for her abuser, but she will also have to suppress the affection she already feels. She will have to do this in spite of the batterer's persuasive arguments that just one more sacrifice, one more proof of her love will end the violence and save the relationship. Since most women derive pride and self-esteem from their capacity to sustain relationships, the batterer is often able to entrap his victim by appealing to her most cherished values. It is not surprising, therefore, that battered women are often persuaded to return after trying to flee from their abusers. Total surrender. Terror, intermittent reward, isolation, and enforced dependency may succeed in creating a submissive and compliant prisoner, but the final step in the psychological control of the victim is not completed until she has been forced to violate her own moral principles and to betray her basic human attachments. Psychologically, this is the most destructive of all coercive techniques, for the victim who has succumbed loathes herself. It is at this point, when the victim under duress participates in the sacrifice of others, that she is truly, quote-unquote, broken. In domestic battery, the violation of principles often involves sexual humiliation. Many battered women describe being coerced into sexual practices that they find immoral or disgusting. Others describe being pressured to lie, to cover up for their mate's dishonesty, or even to participate in illegal activities. The violation of relationship often involves the sacrifice of children. Men who batter their wives are also likely to abuse their children. Although many women who do not dare to defend themselves will defend their children, others are so thoroughly cowed that they fail to intervene even when they see their children mistreated. Some not only suppress their own inner doubts and objections, but cajole their children into compliance or punish them for protesting. Once again, this pattern of betrayal may begin with apparently small concessions, but eventually progresses to the point where even the most outrageous physical or sexual abuse of the children is born in silence. At this point, the demoralization of the battered woman is complete. Survivors of political imprisonment and torture similarly describe being forced to stand by helplessly while witnessing atrocities committed against people they love. In his tale of survival in the Nazi extermination camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Elie Wiesel chronicles the devotion and loyalty that sustained him and his father through unspeakable ordeals. He describes numerous times when both braved danger in order to stay together, and many moments of sharing and tenderness. Nevertheless, he is haunted by the imagery of the few moments when he was faithless to his father. Quote, "The guard began to beat him with an iron bar. At first my father crouched under the blows, then he broke in two, like a dry tree struck by lightning, and collapsed. I had watched the whole scene without moving. I kept quiet. In fact, I was thinking of how to get farther away so that I would not be hit myself. What is more, my anger I felt at that moment was directed not at the guard but against my father. I was angry with him for not knowing how to avoid Idek's outbreak. That is what concentration camp life had made of me." End quote. Realistically, one might argue that it would have been fruitless for the son to come to his father's aid, that in fact an active show of support for his father might have increased the danger to both. But this argument offers little comfort to the victim, who feels completely humiliated by his helplessness. Even the feeling of outrage no longer preserves his dignity, for it has been bent to the will of his enemies and turned against the person he loves. The sense of shame and defeat comes not merely from his failure to intercede, but also from the realization that his captors have usurped his inner life. Prisoners, even those who have successfully resisted and understand that under extreme duress anyone can be quote-unquote broken, they generally distinguish two stages in this process. The first is reached when the victim relinquishes her inner autonomy, worldview, moral principles, or connection with others for the sake of survival. There is a shutting down of feelings, thought, initiative, and judgment. The psychiatrist Henry Crystal, who works with survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, describes this state as quote-unquote robotization. Prisoners who have lived through this psychological state often describe themselves as having been reduced to a non-human life form. Here is the testimony of Lovelace on reaching this state of degradation while being forced into prostitution and pornography. Quote, "At first I was certain that God would help me escape, but in time my faith was shaken. I became more and more frightened, scared of everything. The very thought of trying to escape was terrifying. I had been degraded every possible way, stripped of all dignity, reduced to an animal, and then to a vegetable. Whatever strength I had began to disappear. Simple survival took everything. Making it all the way to tomorrow was a victory." End quote. And here's a description of a similarly debased experience by Jacobo Timerman, publisher and man of letters, who was imprisoned and tortured for political dissent. Quote, "Although I cannot transmit the magnitude of that pain, I can perhaps offer some advice to those who will suffer torture in the future. In the year and a half I spent under house arrest, I devoted much thought to my attitude. During torture sessions in solitary confinement, I realized that instinctively I developed an attitude of absolute passivity. I felt I was becoming a vegetable, casting aside all logical emotions and sensations, fear, hatred, vengeance. For any emotion or sensation meant wasting useless energy." End quote. This state of psychological degradation is reversible. During the course of their captivity, victims frequently describe alternating between periods of submission and more active resistance. The second, irreversible stage is the breaking of a person. In the breaking of a person is reached when the victim loses the will to live. This is not the same thing as becoming suicidal. People in captivity live constantly with the fantasy of suicide, and occasional suicide attempts are not inconsistent with a general determination to survive. Timerman, in fact, describes the wish for suicide in these extreme circumstances as a sign of resistance and pride. Suicide, he states, quote, means introducing into your daily life something that is on a par with the violence around you. It's like living on an equal footing with one's jailers, end quote. The stance of suicide is active. It preserves an inner sense of control. As in the case of the hunger strike, the captive asserts his defiance by his willingness to end his life. Losing the will to live, by contrast, represents the final stage of the process that Timerman describes as adopting an attitude of absolute passivity. Survivors of the Nazi concentration camps describe this uniformly fatal condition, which was given the name of Musulman. Prisoners who had reached this point of degradation no longer attempted to find food or to warm themselves, and they made no effort to avoid being beaten. They were regarded as the living dead. The survivors of extreme situations often remember a turning point at which they felt tempted to enter this terminal state, but made an active choice to fight for life. Hurst describes this moment in her Captivity. Quote, I knew that I was growing weaker and weaker from my confinement, but this time the clear sensation came over me that I was dying. There was a threshold of no return that I could sense, and I felt that I was on the brink. My body was exhausted, drained of strength. I could not stand up, even if I were free to walk away. I was so tired, so tired. All I wanted to do was sleep. And I knew that was dangerous, fatal, like the man lost in Arctic snow who, having laid his head down for that delicious nap, never woke again. My mind suddenly was alive and alert to all this. I could see what was happening to me as if I were outside myself. A silent battle was waged there in the closet, and my mind won. Deliberately and clearly I decided that I would not die, not of my own accord. I would fight with everything in my power to survive, end quote. Syndrome of chronic trauma. People subjected to prolonged, repeated trauma develop an insidious progressive form of post-traumatic stress disorder that invades and erodes the personality. While the victim of a single acute trauma may feel after the event that she is, quote-unquote, not herself, the victim of chronic trauma may feel herself to be changed irrevocably, or she may lose the sense that she has any self at all. The worst fear of any traumatized person is that the moment of horror will recur, and this fear is realized in victims of chronic abuse. Not surprisingly, the repetition of trauma amplifies all the hyperarousal symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Chronically traumatized people are continually hypervigilant, anxious, and agitated. The psychiatrist Elaine Helberman describes a state of constant dread experienced by battered women. Quote, events even remotely connected with violence, sirens, thunder, a door slamming, elicited intense fear. There was chronic apprehension of imminent doom, of something terrible always about to happen. Any symbolic or actual sign of potential danger resulted in increased activity, agitation, pacing, screaming, and crying. The women remained vigilant, unable to relax or to sleep. Nightmares were universal, with undisguised themes of violence and danger, end quote. Chronically traumatized people no longer have any baseline state of physical calm or comfort. Over time, they perceive their bodies as having turned against them. They begin to complain not only of insomnia and agitation, but also of numerous types of somatic symptoms. Tension headaches, gastrointestinal disturbances, and abdominal, back, or pelvic pain are extremely common. Survivors may complain of tremors, choking sensations, or a rapid heartbeat. In studies of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, psychosomatic reactions were found to be practically universal. Similar observations are reported in refugees from the concentration camps of Southeast Asia. Some survivors may conceptualize the damage of their prolonged captivity primarily in somatic terms, or they may become so accustomed to their condition that they no longer recognize the connection between their bodily distress symptoms and the climate of terror in which these symptoms were formed. The intrusive symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder also persist in survivors of prolonged, repeated trauma. But unlike the intrusive symptoms after a single acute trauma, which tend to abate in weeks or months, these symptoms may persist with little change for many years after liberation from prolonged captivity. For example, studies of soldiers who had been taken prisoner in the Second World War or the Korean War found that 35 to 40 years after their release, the majority of these men still had nightmares, persistent flashbacks, and extreme reactions to reminders of their prisoner of war experiences. Their symptoms were more severe than those of combat veterans of the same era who had not been captured or imprisoned. After 40 years, survivors of the Nazi concentration camps similarly reported tenacious and severe intrusive symptoms. But the features of post-traumatic stress disorder that become most exaggerated in chronically traumatized people are avoidance or constriction. When the victim has been reduced to a goal of simple survival, psychological constriction becomes an essential form of adaptation. This narrowing applies to every aspect of life, to relationships, activities, thoughts, memories, emotions, and even sensations. And while this constriction is adaptive in captivity, it also leads to a kind of atrophy in the psychological capacities that have been suppressed, and to the overdevelopment of a solitary inner life. People in captivity become adept practitioners of the arts of altered consciousness. Through the practice of dissociation, voluntary thought suppression, minimization, and sometimes outright denial, they learn to alter an unbearable reality. Ordinary psychological language does not have a name for this complex array of mental maneuvers, at once conscious and unconscious. Perhaps the best name for it is doublethink. In Orwell's definition, quote, doublethink means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. The person knows in which direction his memories must be altered. He therefore knows that he is playing tricks with reality, but by the exercise of doublethink, he also satisfies himself that reality is not violated. The process has to be conscious, or it would not be carried out with sufficient precision, but it also has to be unconscious, or it would bring with it a feeling of falsity. Even in using the word doublethink, it is necessary to exercise doublethink, end quote. The ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously is one characteristic of trance states. The ability to alter perception is another. Prisoners frequently instruct one another in the induction of these states through chanting, prayer, and simple hypnotic techniques. These methods are consciously applied to withstand hunger, cold, and pain. Alicia Partnoy, a quote-unquote disappeared woman in Argentina, describes her unsuccessful first attempt to enter a trance state. Quote, it was probably hunger that triggered my curiosity for the extrasensory world. I started by relaxing my muscles. I thought that my mind, relieved of its weight, would travel in the direction I wanted. But the experiment failed. I was expecting that my psyche, lifted to the ceiling, would be able to observe my body lying on a mattress striped with red and filth. It didn't happen quite that way. Perhaps my mind's eyes were blindfolded too. End quote. Later, after learning meditation techniques from other prisoners, she was able to limit her physical perception of pain and emotional reactions of terror and humiliation by altering her sense of reality. Illustrating the degree to which she succeeded in dissociating her experience, she narrates it in the third person. Take off your clothes. She stood in her underwear, her head up. She waited. All clothes off, I told you. She took off the rest of her clothes. She felt as if the guards did not exist, as if they were just repulsive worms that she could erase from her mind by thinking of pleasant things. During prolonged confinement and isolation, some prisoners are able to develop trance capabilities ordinarily seen only in extremely hypnotizable people, including the ability to form positive and negative hallucinations and to dissociate parts of the personality. Elaine Mohammed, a South African political prisoner, describes the psychological alterations of her captivity. Quote, I started hallucinating in prison, presumably to try to combat loneliness. I remember someone asking me during the period of my trial, Elaine, what are you doing? I kept whipping up my hand behind me, and I said to him, I'm stroking my tail. I had conceptualized myself as a squirrel. A lot of my hallucinations were about fear. The windows in my cell were too high to look through, but I would hallucinate something coming into my cell, like a wolf, for example. And I started talking to myself. My second name is Rose, and I've always hated the name. Sometimes I was Rose speaking to Elaine, and sometimes I was Elaine speaking to Rose. I felt that the Elaine part of me was the stronger part, while Rose was the person I despised. She was the weak one who cried and got upset and couldn't handle detention and was going to break down. Elaine could handle it. End quote. In addition to the use of trance states, prisoners develop the capacity voluntarily to restrict and suppress their thoughts. This practice applies especially to any thoughts of the future. Thinking of the future stirs up such intense yearning and hope that prisoners find it unbearable. They quickly learn that these emotions make them vulnerable to disappointment, and that disappointment will make them desperate. They therefore consciously narrow their attention, focusing on extremely limited goals. The future is reduced to a matter of hours or days. Alterations in time sense begin with the obliteration of the future, but eventually progress to the obliteration of the past. Prisoners who are actively resisting consciously cultivate memories of their past lives in order to combat their isolation. But as coercion becomes more extreme and resistance crumbles, prisoners lose the sense of continuity with their past. The past, like the future, becomes too painful to bear, for memory, like hope, brings back the yearning for all that has been lost. Thus, prisoners are eventually reduced to living in an endless present. Primo Levi, a survivor of the Nazi death camps, describes this timeless state. Quote, in the month of August 1944, we who had entered the camp 5 months before now counted among the old ones. Our wisdom lay in not trying to understand, not imagining the future, not tormenting ourselves as to how and when it would all be over, not asking others or ourselves any questions. For living men, the units of time always have a value. For us, history had stopped. End quote. The rupture in continuity between present and past frequently persists even after the prisoner is released. The prisoner may give the appearance of returning to ordinary time while psychologically remaining bound in the timelessness of the prison. In an attempt to re-enter ordinary life, former prisoners may consciously suppress or avoid the memories of their captivity, bringing to bear all the powers of thought control that they have acquired. As a result, the chronic trauma of captivity cannot be integrated into the person's ongoing life story. Studies of prisoners of war, for example, report with astonishment that the men never discussed their experiences with anyone. Often those who married after liberation never told even their wives or children that they had been prisoners. Similarly, studies of concentration camp survivors consistently remark on their refusal to speak of the past. The more the period of captivity is disavowed, however, the more this disconnected fragment of the past remains fully alive, with the immediate and present characteristics of traumatic memory. Thus, even years after liberation, the former prisoner continues to practice doublethink and to exist simultaneously in two realities, 2 points in time. The experience of the present is often hazy and dulled, while the intrusive memories of the past are intense and clear. A study of concentration camp survivors found this double consciousness at work, quote-unquote, in a woman who had been liberated more than 20 years earlier. Watching Israeli soldiers passing outside her window, the woman reported that she knew the soldiers were leaving to fight at the frontier. Simultaneously, however, she knew that they were being driven to their deaths by a Nazi commander. While she did not lose touch with the reality of the present, the compelling reality was that of the past. Along with the alteration in time sense comes a constriction in initiative and planning. Prisoners who have not been entirely broken do not give up the capacity for active engagement with their environment. On the contrary, they often approach the small daily tasks of survival with extraordinary ingenuity and determination. But the field of initiative is increasingly narrowed within confines dictated by the perpetrator. The prisoner no longer thinks of how to escape, but rather of how to stay alive or how to make captivity more bearable. A concentration camp inmate schemes to obtain a pair of shoes, a spoon, or a blanket. A group of political prisoners conspire to grow a few vegetables. A prostitute maneuvers to hide some money from her pimp. A battered woman teaches her children to hide when an attack is imminent. This narrowing in the range of initiative becomes habitual with prolonged captivity, and it must be unlearned after the prisoner is liberated. A political dissident, Mauricio Rosenkopf, describes the difficulties of returning to a life of freedom after many years of imprisonment. Quote, once we got out, we were suddenly confronted with all these problems, ridiculous problems. Doorknobs, for instance. I had no reflex any longer to reach for the knobs of doors. I hadn't been allowed to for over 13 years. I'd come to a closed door and found myself momentarily stymied. I couldn't remember what to do next, or how to make a dark room light, how to work, pay bills, shop, visit friends, answer questions. My daughter tells me to do this or that. The one problem I can handle, the two I can handle, but when the third request comes, I can hear her voice, but my head is lost in the clouds. End quote. This constriction in the capacities for active engagement with the world, which is common even after a single trauma, becomes most pronounced in chronically traumatized people who are often described as passive or helpless. Some theorists have mistakenly applied the concept of learned helplessness to the situation of battered women and other chronically traumatized people. Such concepts tend to portray the victim as simply defeated or apathetic, whereas, in fact, a much livelier and more complex inner struggle is usually taking place. In most cases, the victim has not given up, but she has learned that every action will be watched, that most actions will be thwarted, and that she will pay dearly for failure. To the extent that the perpetrator has succeeded in enforcing his demand for total submission, she will perceive any exercise of her own initiative as insubordination. Before undertaking any action, she will scan the environment, expecting retaliation. Prolonged captivity undermines or destroys the ordinary sense of a relatively safe sphere of initiative in which there is some tolerance for trial and error. To the chronically traumatized person, any action has potentially dire consequences. There is no room for mistakes. Rosenkopf describes his constant expectation of punishment. Quote, I'm in a perpetual cringe. I'm constantly stopping to let whoever is behind me pass. My body keeps expecting a blow. End quote. The sense that the perpetrator is still present even after liberation signifies a major alteration in the victim's relational world. The enforced relationship during captivity, which of necessity monopolizes the victim's attention, becomes part of the victim's inner life and continues to engross her attention after release. In political prisoners, this continued relationship may take the form of brooding preoccupation with the criminal careers of their captors, or with more abstract concerns about the unchecked forces of evil in the world. Released prisoners often continue to attract their captors and to fear them. In sexual, domestic, and religious cult prisoners, this continued relationship may take a more ambivalent form. The victim may continue to fear her former captor and to expect that he will eventually hunt her down, but she may also feel empty, confused, and worthless without him. In political prisoners who have not been entirely isolated, the malignant relationship with the perpetrator may be mitigated by attachments to people who share their fate. Those prisoners who have had the good fortune to bond with others know the generosity, courage, and devotion that people can muster in extremity. The capacity to form strong attachments is not destroyed, even under the most diabolical conditions. Prisoner friendships flourished even in the Nazi death camps. A study of prisoner relationships in these camps found that the overwhelming majority of survivors became part of a quote-unquote stable pair, a loyal buddy relationship of mutual sharing and protection, leading to the conclusion that the pair, rather than the individual, was the quote-unquote basic unit of survival. In isolated prisoners, however, where there is no opportunity to bond with pairs, pair bonding may occur between victim and perpetrator, and this relationship may come to feel like the basic unit of survival. This is the traumatic bonding that occurs in hostages who come to view their captors as their saviors and to fear and hate their rescuers. Martin Simons, a psychoanalyst and police officer, describes this process as an enforced regression to psychological infantilism, which, quote, compels victims to cling to the very person who is endangering their life, end quote. He observes this process regularly in policemen who have been kidnapped and held hostage in the line of duty. The same traumatic bonding may occur between a battered woman and her abuser. The repeated experience of terror and reprieve, especially within the isolated context of a love relationship, may result in a feeling of intense, almost worshipful dependence upon an all-powerful, godlike authority. The victim may live in terror of his wrath, but she may also view him as the source of strength, guidance, and life itself. The relationship may take on an extraordinary quality of specialness. Some battered women speak of entering a kind of exclusive, almost delusional world, embracing the grandiose belief system of their mates and voluntarily suppressing their own doubts as a proof of loyalty and submission. Similar experiences are regularly reported by people who have been inducted into totalitarian religious cults. Even after the victim has escaped, it is not possible simply to reconstitute relationships of the sort that existed prior to captivity, for all relationships are now viewed through the lens of extremity. Just as there is no range of moderate engagement or risk for initiative, there is no range of moderate engagement or risk for relationship. No ordinary relationship offers the same degree of intensity as the pathological bond with the abuser. In every encounter, basic trust is in question. To the released prisoner, there is only one story, the story of atrocity. And there are only a limited number of roles. One can be a perpetrator, a passive witness, an ally, or a rescuer. Every new or old relationship is approached with the implicit question, which side are you on? The victim's greatest contempt is often reserved not for the perpetrator, but for the passive bystander. Again, we hear the voice of the coerced prostitute Lovelace, dismissing those who failed to intervene. Quote, most people don't know how hard I judge them because they don't say anything. All I do is cross them off the list. forever. These men had their chance to help me and they didn't respond, end quote. The same bitterness and sense of abandonment is expressed by the political prisoner Timerman. Quote, the Holocaust will be understood not so much for the number of victims as for the magnitude of the silence. And what obsesses me most is the repetition of silence, end quote. Prolonged captivity disrupts all human relationships and amplifies the dialectic of trauma. The survivor oscillates between intense attachment and terrified withdrawal. She approaches all relationships as though questions of life and death are at stake. She may cling desperately to a person whom she perceives as a rescuer, flee suddenly from a person she suspects to be a perpetrator or accomplice, show great loyalty and devotion to a person she perceives as an ally, and heap wrath and scorn on a person who appears to be a complacent bystander. The roles she assigns to others may change suddenly as the result of small lapses or disappointments, for no internal representation of another person is any longer secure. Once again, there is no room for mistakes. Over time, as most people fail the survivor's exacting tests of trustworthiness, she tends to withdraw from relationships. The isolation of the survivor thus persists even after she is free. Prolonged captivity also produces profound alterations in the victim's identity. All the psychological structures of the self, the image of the body, the internalized images of others, and the values and ideals that lend a person a sense of coherence and purpose, have been invaded and systematically broken down. In many totalitarian systems, this dehumanizing process is carried to the extent of taking away the victim's name. Timerman calls himself, quote, a prisoner without a name, end quote. In concentration camps, the captive's name is replaced with the non-human designation, a number. In political or religious cults and in organized sexual exploitation, the victim is often given a new name to signify the total obliteration of her previous identity and her submission to the new order. Thus, Patricia Hearst was rebaptized Tanya. The revolutionary Linda Borman was renamed Linda Lovelace, the whore. Even after release from captivity, the victim cannot assume her former identity. Whatever new identity she develops in freedom must include the memory of her enslaved self. Her image of her body must include a body that can be controlled and violated. Her image of herself in relation to others must include a person who can lose and be lost to others. And her moral ideals must coexist with knowledge of the capacity for evil, both within others and within herself. If, under duress, she has betrayed her own principles or has sacrificed other people, she now has to live with the image of herself as an accomplice of the perpetrator, a quote-unquote broken person. The result for most victims is a contaminated identity. Victims may be preoccupied with shame, self-loathing, and a sense of failure. In the most severe cases, the victim retains the dehumanized identity of a captive who has been reduced to the level of elemental survival, the robot, animal, or vegetable. The psychiatrist William Niederland, in studies of survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, observed that alterations of personal identity were a constant feature of the quote-unquote survivor syndrome. While the majority of his patients complained, "I am now a different person," the most severely harmed stated simply, "I am not a person." These profound alterations in the self and in relationships inevitably result in the questioning of basic tenets of faith. There are people with strong and secure belief systems who can endure the ordeals of imprisonment and emerge with their faith intact or strengthened, but these are the extraordinary few. The majority of people experience the bitterness of being forsaken by God. The Holocaust survivor Wiesel gives voice to this bitterness. "Never shall I forget those flames which consume my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget those things, even if I am even if I am condemned to live as long as God himself. Never." End quote. These staggering psychological losses can result in a tenacious state of depression. Protracted depression is the most common finding in virtually all clinical studies of chronically traumatized people. Every aspect of the experience of prolonged trauma works to aggravate depressive symptoms. The chronic hyperarousal and intrusive symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder fuse with the vegetative symptoms of depression, producing what Niederland called the quote-unquote survival triad of insomnia, nightmares, and psychosomatic complaints. The dissociative symptoms of the disorder merge with the concentration difficulties of depression. The paralysis of initiative of chronic trauma combines with the apathy and helplessness of depression. The disruption and attachment of chronic trauma reinforces the isolation of depression. The debased self-image of chronic trauma fuels the guilty ruminations of depression, and the loss of faith suffered in chronic trauma merges with the hopelessness of depression. The intense anger of the imprisoned person also adds to the depressive burden. During captivity, the victim cannot express her humiliated rage at the perpetrator, for to do so would jeopardize her survival. Even after release, the former prisoner may continue to fear retribution and may be slow to express rage against her captor. Moreover, she is left with a burden of unexpressed rage against all who remained indifferent to her fate and who failed to help her. Occasional outbursts of rage may further alienate the survivor from others and prevent the restoration of relationships. In an effort to control her rage, the survivor may withdraw even further from other people, thus perpetuating her isolation. Finally, the survivor may direct her rage and hatred against herself. Suicidality, which sometimes served as a form of resistance during imprisonment, may persist long after release when it no longer serves any adaptive purpose. Studies of returned prisoners of war consistently document increased mortality as a result of homicide, suicide, and suspicious accidents. Studies of battered women similarly reported tenacious suicidality. In one group of 100 battered women, 42% had attempted suicide. Thus, former prisoners carry their captors' hatred with them even after release, and sometimes they continue to carry out their captors' destructive purposes with their own hands. Long after their liberation, people who have been subjected to coercive control bear the psychological scars of captivity. They suffer not only from a classic post-traumatic syndrome, but also from profound alteration in their relations with God, with other people, and with themselves. In the words of the Holocaust survivor Levy, quote, "We have learnt that our personality is fragile, that it is in much more danger than our life. And the old wise ones, instead of warning us, 'Remember that you must die,' would have done much better to remind us of this greater danger that threatens us. If from inside the lager a message could have seeped out to free men, it would have been this: take care not to suffer in your own homes, which is inflicted on us here." End quote.